So I finally got around to playing Black Ops Cold War. It's been quite some time since I've played a newer Call of Duty, with, up until recently, the newest one I owned being Black Ops 3, which I only played zombies on. Other than that, I've kind of been checked out of the franchise for nearly a decade. After COD Ghosts, I saw the series taking a drastically different direction to what I was used to, and suffice to say I wasn't a fan. So I took a break that I never properly returned from until now. Recently, there was a big sale on the most of the Call of Duty games on Steam, so I decided to treat myself with some nostalgia in the form of Black Ops 2, Ghosts, and Cold War. I already did a video on Black Ops 2, so if you want to see that, click the link on screen. I'll be doing a video on Ghosts in the future, so if you're new around here, hit that subscribe button and leave a like to support the channel. With that out of the way, let's get into the newest Call of Duty game I've finally gotten around to playing, Cold War. I remember when this game first came out. I was sitting in a small apartment in England, of all places, in a town that looked more like a Call of Duty level than it should have, with decrepit buildings, trash lining the streets, burnt-out cars, and people with machetes ending up on the news at an alarming regular basis. My girlfriend had ordered us some pizza from Papa John's, and on the cover of the box there was an advertisement for Black Ops Cold War. That was my first encounter with the game. As I said, I've been sort of out of the loop with Call of Duty games, and by late 2020 I had kind of lost track of the annual releases. Were they back to World War II now? Were they still doing that advanced movement thing? It was anyone's guess as far as I was concerned, but seeing that box art advertisement admittedly piqued my interest. In the current FPS landscape full of tactical, modern warfare shooters, World War II, and seemingly endless future-themed titles, it was refreshing to see something that was somewhat new. Sure, you had Black Ops 1 and even parts of Black Ops 2's campaign that took place during the Cold War, but to see Call of Duty go full into the theme of conflict between America and Russia in the 1980s was sure to be something cool. But I'm not one to hop on trends, so I waited to buy the game until now, and 2.5 years later, I finally got to try it out. So I'm going to break this down into the good, bad, and the flat-out ugly. First, let's start out with the good. Before we get into talking about the gameplay, I have to praise the graphics. This game looks absolutely phenomenal. I was streaming it to my fiancée the other day, and she asked me what year it came out and remarked on how good it looked, especially when you consider certain other releases that came out around the same time look like crap. Yeah, I never miss a chance to roast 343. This game graphically blows me away. Not just the dynamic lighting, but the lighting in general I especially want to mention. One of the things I noticed first with Black Ops Cold War is just how good that lighting can be at times. Being a massive fan of Treyarch Zombies mode, I had to check that out before anything else, and one of the first things I noticed in addition to the classic World at War map Nacht der Untoten making somewhat of a return, was the way the game handles its lighting. One of my biggest criticisms with other games is that nighttime often doesn't feel like nighttime. Dark interiors are far too bright to feel remotely realistic. As someone who spent a lot of their late teens and early 20s exploring the woods and looking at abandoned buildings, I really tend to notice things like that in games. Most are either too dark or too bright in all the wrong places, but Cold War does not have this problem. I was blown away when I went from being outside in a bright, snowy environment to the dark, damp interior of the ever-familiar help room from the original Nacht der Untoten map. How I had to actually use a flashlight to get around, how the darkness just consumed the room much like it tends to do in a real abandoned building. This carries over well into the rest of the game too, with multiplayer maps having brightly lit areas, as well as dark corners with dynamic light sources everywhere. Standing by a couple of arcade machines or energy portals in the zombies mode and seeing the purple light from them actually affect the color of my gun was just something I found really cool. Now I realize this isn't the first game to do this, but it really caught my attention for some reason. Lighting aside, the textures on these levels are all incredibly detailed, as were the visuals themselves. You can really tell they took advantage of modern hardware as much as possible by putting lots of debris and random items around the maps to make them feel more alive. This is something Call of Duty has always been relatively good at, but Cold War just takes it to another level. But visuals aside, let's talk about the actual gameplay. I would say the gunplay and movement is pretty solid. A bit different than what I'm used to, as the guns seem to wobble a lot more when you move, and I can really see the progress made over the last couple of years in terms of making the movement feel more organic. You no longer feel like some kind of infallible, superhuman cyborg that has solid steel arms. You now feel like the guns actually have weight to them, and the sound design also makes them feel a bit more realistic. Recoil patterns feel natural, and the weapons overall are pretty balanced. Granted, the game is a few years old, which meant I was mostly playing the multiplayer against bots, just so I could get a match, but the game felt extremely fun to play, which, in my view, is probably the most important thing. A gripe I have with a lot of other shooters is that most weapons in them just aren't fun to use. There's usually a few guns that float their way to the top, while others are mostly forgotten about, simply due to the lack of viabilities. This isn't the case in Cold War. I had fun using almost all the weapons available to me, be it in the campaign, zombies, or multiplayer. I found myself wanting to pick up new ones just to try them out. I used snipers, LMGs, assault rifles, even the new 3-round burst tactical rifles, as well as others. The perks and abilities are straightforward and fun. Unlike some of the other entries in the franchise, they feel less gimmicky and they actually just work. The kill streaks felt rewarding, and there's a decent variety of maps to play on, including quite a few remakes or, in a lot of cases, just ports from older Call of Duty games. I have mixed opinions on this, as for me, having taken such a long break from the franchise, a lot of these maps like Raid or Standoff came from the last game I really played, so they don't seem as old, and I did just make a video about Black Ops 2, so I kind of did recently play them, so maybe that's why, but I don't know. Still, they were cool, and the visual upgrades provided to them with Cold War's engine were definitely welcome. The only map that I would say looks visually worse than its original was Hijacked from Black Ops 2, but I think that's more a matter of personal preference, as the Cold War version has a bit of a brighter vibe to it. The remade maps for the most part are decent ones, and all the new maps are a lot of fun, pretty well set up, but that's all I have to say on the multiplayer side of things. Now to talk more specifically about the Zombies mode, I have to say I went into this knowing it was going to be different than what I was used to. I had heard they made some changes. Gobblegums, for one, from Black Ops 3 are gone. There are loadouts now, and in general it seems to be a faster-paced experience, but that's not too bad, as I don't feel the mode loses its sense of identity. Zombies is still very much the zombies we know and love, for the most part. The maps are a bit bigger and more open, they're more objective-focused, and there's now an option to call for an extraction every so often, which is actually a welcome addition in my opinion. I've played probably what amounts to thousands of hours of Zombies over the years, and there's only so many times you can play the same loop over and over again before it gets stale. There have been countless times where I get to around 20 or 30 and just start to get bored, so implementing an extraction mechanic that actually makes you feel like you did something other than just intentionally dying or turning the game off is nice. It's also something they carried over from custom zombies, which is a thing I have been a fan of for ages. I've probably played most of the custom zombies levels on World at War and a good chunk of them on Black Ops 3, and seeing what they've done with Cold War, I can tell the developers really took care and paid attention to some of what the community was making, and it goes a long way. That's something I really have to stress here. When I play Cold War Zombies, I get the impression the developers care. They listen to their fan base and they pay attention to what people love and what people hate. As a predominantly Halo player up until recently that has had to deal with all the issues that franchise has for years, it's nice to actually see a developer that understands and respects what people love about their franchise when it comes to zombies. The biggest change with the mode is the loadout system, which makes the game go a lot faster, especially in the earlier rounds. You don't have to rummage around to try to find a decent gun. You can get right into the action, which is sort of a double-edged sword, which I'll talk more about in a minute. There's also the crates where you can restore your ammo at for any gun, which, while I didn't like it at first, the addition of these bullet-spongy boss monsters that appear every so often balances that out pretty well. It's definitely a slight departure from the zombies of old, but I still think a worthy addition to the series. While the maps aren't nearly as iconic as the old ones like Kino, 5, Der Riese, Revelations, or even Transit, I think given enough time, players will look back on these pretty fondly. If anything negative could be said about the Zombies game mode, I think it's just that zombies as a theme has kind of been overdone, and I think people are just getting tired of it. But with that and what they had to work with, I think Cold War Zombies hits the nail on the head in terms of being what I expected it to be. It works well, and at the end of the day, I actually liked the faster-paced early rounds. Like I said before, I've played thousands of hours of Zombies. I know how slow the early rounds go every time, and while I certainly wouldn't want to skip them altogether, the monotony and slow pace can sometimes feel a bit too sluggish, so getting a sped-up version of that in Cold War is actually kind of nice. My biggest gripe with Cold War Zombies has to be with the loadout system. It makes the mystery box feel essentially useless. There's no point in rolling the box over and over again to try to get a commando or a Galil if you can just spawn in with one. Sure, there's the old wonder weapon sitting in the box, but honestly, ammo is so regularly available and cheap for loadout weapons, there's really no point. Really, just the whole weapon setup feels a bit too basic, like it makes the mode lack depth. For example, what I mean by this, in World at War, there was a MP40 wall buy in one of the teleporter rooms on Doriz. I've always preferred the MP40 to the Thompson because it doesn't burn through ammo as quickly, it's better for headshots, and just overall, to me, seems like the better weapon. But the caveat to the MP40 was that it was in a hard-to-reach place that was out of the way when you needed ammo. In Black Ops Cold War, this just isn't a thing because there's ammo crates all over the map, and you can spawn in with pretty much any gun you want. And with that and other things, it again just takes some of the depth out of the mode, but don't let that alone discourage you from giving it a try. It's still a lot of fun for what it is. Then there's also a third iteration of Dead Ops Arcade, which I don't have loads to say about, and an open world zombies mode called Outbreak, which is pretty cool, but it doesn't do anything super groundbreaking from what I can see thus far. It's still a nice concept. I'd like to check that out further. Cold War Zombies, at the end of the day, while a bit different to what it used to be, is still incredibly fun. But now we have to move on and talk about the bad stuff. Campaign. Where do I even start? First off, the whole thing was really short, and while there are loads of cool set pieces that make me want to explore the game world, it doesn't let me. Despite being a game about covert spies going behind enemy lines and sneaking around to look for intel, the game sure is very structured and linear. The campaign feels more like a poorly written, drawn-out movie at times rather than an actual game. You spend a lot of time listening to exposition, which isn't anything new for a Call of Duty campaign, especially in the quote-unquote modern era. I mean, I played through Black Ops 2 recently, and that has a lot of exposition, but the amount of exposition in Cold War that just straight up doesn't make sense is just laughable. Look, I know it's a Call of Duty campaign. I know they were never known for their historical accuracy. But East German soldiers using Western weaponry regularly? Or how about Russian soldiers on US soil getting into massive firefights? I'm not talking about a couple of spies or covert operatives. I'm talking about full-on, just massive gunfights destroying a small town. If that would have happened in real life, World War III would have happened very quickly, but for some reason in this universe, it just happens and then is never mentioned again and it's completely glossed over. It doesn't make any sense. Then you have straight up unnecessary amounts of violence and war crimes at times. I mean, I get it. It's Black Ops, so to say. But randomly having prisoners get executed by the player just because the player wants that to happen doesn't make sense. I mean, generally speaking, you want intel out of prisoners. That's why you take them alive in the first place. But no, this game just gives you the choice to be a psychopathic murderer just because you feel like it. And I'm not trying to be a Karen here and complain, oh, it's too violent. No, I think violent scenes in the right places and in the right context can add a lot to a game one way or another. But they just don't make sense in this context. Like, for example, you have these takedown moves, which were a really cool concept that I was excited when I first saw them, but they became far too repetitive and excessive. When I go and play a game like Dune 2016, and there's all these over-the-top graphic finisher moves, that's okay because I expect that from Doom. But beating someone up, stabbing them, then shooting them in the head point blank when I'm supposed to be this stealthy, undercover spy just really doesn't fit the mood of the game. Maybe that's just me, but it really doesn't sit well. So I mentioned choices before, and I'm probably going to get some backlash for this next one, but I don't care. So the game for some reason allows you to customize the backstory of one of the player characters. You actually play as a few different characters, but for some reason it allows you to set up the backstory and gender for one of them. I don't really know why they did that. I mean, it's Call of Duty, it's not Elder Scrolls, it's not an RPG, but whatever. So they let you customize the gender, and there are 4 options, because apparently having male, female, and classified wasn't enough. No, they had to go and put non-binary in there. For starters, while I realize non-binary encompasses anything that doesn't fit into male or female, As a demi-queer Mi-24 attack helicopter left in the ruins of Chernobyl myself, I am highly offended that my gender was not directly represented. In all seriousness, though, this is just ridiculous. How much does the woke mob need to be pandered to at this point? That we now have a non-binary as a gender option in a game meant to take place in a 1980s Special Forces military setting. Look, if this was a futuristic 2100s themed game, I'd say okay, maybe. Things are a bit wacky in most sci-fis anyway, but this is the 1980s. You mean to tell me someone went and filled out in military documents that they were non-binary in the 80s and that was just accepted? In Special Forces? A big point of the military is uniformity, the lack of individuality, the ability to function as one cohesive unit, to put your individual self aside, not to stand out and get special pronouns and recognition, but whatever. Society's going to hell and wokeism is ruining entertainment. But 8 million genders aside, this whole campaign is just full of historical inaccuracies, things that just don't make logical sense, like a rooftop fight in a crowded Netherlands neighborhood that somehow doesn't draw the attention of absolutely anyone and everyone, never mind law enforcement or whatever. It, just from a story standpoint, is poorly written and again doesn't make any sense. Then there's the absolutely shameless shoehorning in of old characters because nostalgia, I guess. They generally tend to stick to the characters' established personalities, which is good, but I may be in the minority here, but I personally feel that they shouldn't have brought these characters back. Characters like Woods, Hudson, and Mason's stories were best left finished in Black Ops 2. It kind of brought it to a nice end there. But yet we have them brought back here for some reason, and I kind of feel like they only did that for marketing purposes. But again, maybe that's just me. At the end of the day, the campaign is a bland, unoriginal, forgettable product of modern lazy writing, and I can't say I enjoyed much of it. Not even a little bit. I think the coolest thing, there's a small part of it that does a major callback to some of the events in Black Ops 1, but other than that, from a gameplay and a story standpoint, it is by far the weakest part of Cold War. So other than the campaign being a huge stinker, there are the obvious bad gaming trends of the modern day, like a ridiculous amount of microtransactions, but one thing that annoys me even more than that is the fact that the main menu is divided into two sections, one for Cold War and the other for Modern Warfare 2 Warzone. I didn't install the game for Warzone, but for some reason Activision really wants to make sure that I know it exists every step of the way. The amount of product pushing and advertisement that happens when I'm just trying to play Cold War is infuriating. You go to the main menu, half of it is Warzone. You go to select zombies, a pop-up for Warzone appears. You want to play multiplayer? Another pop-up telling you to play Warzone instead. From what I understand, this is a big problem with modern COD, where it seems like Activision does its absolute best to keep people from playing the old games, even when the quote-unquote old ones have only been out for a year or two. I've heard recently they went and shut down fan projects that were aiming to make old games playable without all the hackers and glitches, and overall it's pretty disgusting behavior from a giant megacorporation. It really seems like Activision pushes hard that you play anything but the latest game at this point, and it sucks, especially considering that these games don't come cheap. The worst part of it all is that despite the fact that I have no desire to play Warzone 2, it still has to remain installed on my computer. You have the option to uninstall campaign if you don't want it. You can uninstall zombies, even the multiplayer. But Warzone, which, if I have to take a guess at it, it probably takes up a good chunk of the over 200 gigabytes required for this game, cannot be uninstalled without uninstalling the game that I actually want. This really shouldn't even be in the bad category, probably more the ugly category, which will bring me to, well, the ugly. It gets worse. So if Warzone 2 being forced down your throat isn't your cup of tea, this is even worse than that. Always online DRM. My internet was out for most of this week and has been on and off pretty sporadically as of the writing of this script, and as a result, I couldn't even play the single player of the game that I paid for. What's worse still is that even if you were online when the game started, if for any reason whatsoever you lose connection for a second, The game just straight up stops you from playing and kicks you out. It doesn't matter if you're 2 hours into doing an Easter egg on zombies. It doesn't matter if you were having a great time playing bots in the multiplayer. It doesn't even matter if you were living your life's fantasy of being a pangendered octopus taking down East Germany. The game will just kick you out of it because of the DRM. It's ridiculous. The fact of the matter is, people who pirate games are going to continue to pirate them regardless of what kind of ridiculous DRM is put into it. The only thing the DRM does is hurt actual paying customers. It is absurd, unnecessary, and incredibly anti-consumer. Let me ask Activision, not that they're actually listening, but let me ask, what happens when your servers go out? What happens when you shut them down because the game is too old? Do people just not get to play their games anymore? Does game preservation mean nothing to you guys? Of course not, because that doesn't make profits. This, and this alone, makes me not want to recommend this game to anyone. And that's a damn shame, because Black Ops Cold War as a game in and of itself is overall really enjoyable. I love the zombies mode despite my minor gripes with it here and there. The multiplayer, even against bots, is a good time. The amount of maps we have is great. You can really tell the developers of the game went all in and put a lot of passion and effort into it to make a great game for the fans. But the publisher, with their god-awful always online DRM, has to ruin the fun. Really, this whole games as a service idea where you don't actually own your games and they're more like a virtual online arcade that can close its doors to you at any time needs to die. Games as a service needs to be thrown back into the fiery pits of hell where it came from and never resurface again. You know, it's funny. I somewhat recently made a video about CNC4, which originally dropped in 2010, and it had the same always online system. And in fact, a lot of the games at the time were going in that direction, but there was massive backlash from the gaming community against it. So it kind of died off for a while to a large extent, at least for a couple of years. But for some reason lately, it's back in force and only getting worse. I heard with the new Modern Warfare 2, players are required to register with a phone number just to play the game? That's absurd. I honestly think there needs to be some kind of legislation regarding games and the fact that they are a product, not a service, and they shouldn't be able to be sold the way that they are, at least not the way it's being done right now. But economic policy ranting aside, that's my thoughts on Black Ops Cold War. The good, the bad, and the ugly. What are your thoughts on this game, if you've played it? Let me know in the comments below. As always, I thank you so much for watching. Leave a like on the video if you did enjoy. Have a great day, and stay safe. Goodbye.